Morning my daughter-in-law told me I smelled like a nursing home. I was standing in my own kitchen. Not her kitchen, mine. The one I built with my own two hands, 32 years ago when Dorothy and I first moved to Cloverfield Road, back when the neighborhood still had empty lots, and the sound of kids playing until dark. I had refinished those oak cabinets myself. I had laid that tile floor myself. And I was standing on it in my house, holding a cup of coffee I'd made in my own coffee maker, when my son's wife wrinkled her nose and said it loud enough for my son to hear from the living room. He didn't say a word. That should have been the moment I understood what I was dealing with. But I was 63 years old. I just buried my wife 4 months earlier, and I was still the kind of man who believed family worked things out. So I set my cup down, and I said nothing. Her name was Vanessa. She'd married my son, Miles, 6 years before Dorothy passed. I remember the first time Miles brought her home for Thanksgiving. She was pretty in that careful, practiced way, and she spent most of dinner asking questions about the house. Not the family. The house. How many square feet, what the property taxes ran, whether we'd ever thought about selling and moving somewhere warmer. Dorothy had squeezed my hand under the table. We didn't say anything about it then, but later that night, lying in bed with the lamp still on, my wife looked at the ceiling and said, quietly, "She's counting things, Ray." "Counting what?" I asked. "Everything," Dorothy said, and then she turned off the lamp. That was Dorothy. 41 years of marriage, and she could read a room the way other people read a book. Fast, accurate, and she remembered every word. After she died, things changed quickly. Faster than I expected, though I'm not sure what I expected. Grief does something to your sense of time. The days stretch and compress at the same time, and you find yourself standing in the cereal aisle at the grocery store for 15 minutes because you keep reaching for the brand she liked, and then remembering there's no reason to anymore. Miles started coming around more. That part was good. He'd call ahead, he'd stop by on weekends, he'd sit with me at the kitchen table and drink coffee and talk about nothing in particular, the way men do when they don't know how to talk about the real thing. I appreciated it. I told him so. But Vanessa started coming with him, and that was different. She'd walk through the house with her eyes moving, not looking at me, not looking at Miles, looking at things. The furniture, the art on the walls, most of it pieces Dorothy had collected at local galleries over the years. The silver picture frames, the bookshelves. She never touched anything. She just looked the way you look at something you're calculating. The first request came 8 weeks after the funeral. Miles sat down across from me one evening, and I could tell by the way he was holding his shoulders that this wasn't a casual visit. Vanessa was in the living room, just close enough to hear. He said they were having some trouble with their mortgage payment, just temporarily. His company had restructured and his hours had been cut, and Vanessa's real estate business was in a slow quarter. He said they needed to borrow $9,000 to cover 2 months and catch up. He said they'd pay it back by summer. I wrote the check that night. They didn't pay it back by summer. By the following spring, the loans. I had started thinking of them as loans, though I was beginning to understand they were something else. Totaled just over $34,000. Each time there was a reason. The car needed a new transmission. Vanessa's mother had a medical situation. The roof on their house had started leaking and the contractor wanted payment up front. I gave and I gave and I told myself this was what family did. What I didn't tell them, what I hadn't told anyone except Dorothy, and the two of us had agreed on it together years before any of this happened, was that we were not the people we appeared to be. Dorothy and I had lived carefully, deliberately. We drove practical cars and bought clothes on sale and took our vacations in the off-season when the rates were cheaper. We lived in a nice enough house on a nice enough street, and we were comfortable, and nobody who knew us would have guessed at the rest of it. The rest of it was this: over 4 decades of disciplined saving, a small business I'd sold in 2009 for more than anyone expected, and a real estate portfolio I'd quietly assembled across 2 counties, 14 properties, most of them modest rentals that threw off steady income. Our net worth at the time Dorothy passed was just over $9 million. $9 million. invested conservatively, managed carefully, sitting in accounts and properties that had no visible connection to the man who drove a 7-year-old Ford pickup and ate lunch at Denny's on Tuesdays because he liked the senior discount. Dorothy and I had built that invisibility on purpose. We'd seen what money did to families. We'd watched it happen to her brother's household, to two sets of friends who'd come into inheritance, and watched their children transform into strangers. We decided, without ever making it dramatic, that we would live like we lived and keep the rest quiet. And for a long time, it worked. But Dorothy was gone now, and Miles, my son, my boy, who I had coached through Little League and taught to drive in an empty church parking lot and help move into his first apartment, Miles had found someone who was counting things. The slap happened on a Thursday in March. I had driven to their house, which was actually mine. I owned it, had bought it as an investment property 12 years earlier, and rented it to them, at below market rate, another thing Vanessa didn't know. I had driven over because Miles had called and said Vanessa wanted to discuss the financial situation, and I thought perhaps we were finally going to have an honest conversation. I should have known better. I walked in, and Vanessa was at the kitchen table with a yellow legal pad covered in numbers. Miles was standing by the window with his hands in his pockets, not looking at me. I sat down. I asked how they were doing. Vanessa said they were not doing well. She said the arrangement we had was not working for their long-term stability. She said, and this is the part I still have to stop and breathe through when I think about it. She said that it was time for me to contribute more meaningfully to the family. I asked her what she meant by that. She meant she wanted me to transfer a portion of my assets into their names. She had written numbers on the legal pad. She slid it across the table. I looked at the numbers for a moment. Then I looked up at my son, still standing by the window. I said, Miles. He looked at the floor. I pushed the legal pad back across the table and said I wasn't going to do that. I said it calmly. I was 67 years old, and I had buried my wife, and I was tired of a lot of things, but I was not going to be spoken to this way in a house I owned. Vanessa stood up. What happened next took maybe 2 seconds. She said something I won't repeat, something about old men who hoard money while their families suffer, and then her hand came across and hit the side of my face hard enough that my glasses went sideways and I caught the edge of the table, trying not to fall. The room was very quiet after that. I straightened my glasses. I looked at Miles. He was still looking at the floor. I stood up, pushed the chair in, and walked to the front door. I picked up my jacket from the hook, the same hook I had installed myself when I bought that house, and I walked out without saying anything else. I sat in my truck in their driveway for a few minutes. My ear was ringing. The side of my face felt hot. I looked at the house through the windshield and I thought about Dorothy and about what she had said to me once, years ago, when I'd asked her what she would do if she ever felt truly wronged by someone she loved. She'd said, I'd make sure the lesson was one they could feel. I drove home. I called my attorney. His name was Paul Whitmore, and he had been my lawyer for 22 years, and he was the only person outside of my marriage who knew the full picture of what Dorothy and I had built. I told him what had happened. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, Ray, what do you want to do? I told him. The first thing was the house on Cloverfield, not the one I lived in, the one they lived in. I told Paul to begin the process of listing it. Fair market value, no special consideration, no family discount. He said the market was strong in that area and we'd likely have offers within 2 weeks. Give him 60 days notice, I said. Standard legal requirements, nothing more. The second thing was the accounts. I had set up a trust years earlier with Dorothy, and the original beneficiaries had included Miles. I told Paul to schedule a meeting with the estate attorney to review the distribution structure. I wasn't removing Miles entirely. That was a decision I wanted to make carefully, not in anger, but I wanted everything examined, and I wanted options. The third thing was something I hadn't told Paul about yet. A few years earlier, before Dorothy got sick, we had started donating quietly to a foundation that supported housing and education for families in under-resourced communities in our county. We gave enough each year that we knew the director, a woman named Patricia. No, I need a different name. A woman named Sylvia, who ran the organization with the kind of focused, unflashy competence that Dorothy had always admired. I called Sylvia the morning after I called Paul. I told her Dorothy had always wanted to do something more significant. I told her I was ready to talk about what that looked like. The 60-day notice went out on a Tuesday. Miles called me that same evening. His voice was different than I expected, not angry, not immediately. He sounded confused. He said there must be a mistake, that the property management company had sent a notice to vacate. I told him there was no mistake. He said, "Dad, what are you doing?" I said I was doing what I should have done a long time ago, and that I wished he had said something to me when he was standing by the window watching his wife hit his father across the face, and that I hoped he'd think about that. He started to say something else. I said goodnight and hung up. I won't pretend those weeks were easy. There's a particular kind of grief that comes from watching your child turn into someone you don't recognize, and it sits differently than other losses. It doesn't have the clean edges of death. It's ragged, and it stays. I kept busy. I drove out to the rental properties twice a week to check on things. I had lunch with Paul on Thursdays. I started going to an early morning walk group at the park near my house. Mostly retired folks. A few widows and widowers, people who understood what it meant to be relearning the shape of their days. There was a man there, a retired high school principal named Bernard, who had been through something similar with his own family. We didn't talk about it directly, but we understood each other. Vanessa called once. I didn't answer. She left a voicemail that started with an apology and moved quickly into explanation and then into something that sounded like threat before the message cut off. I forwarded it to Paul without listening to it twice. The house sold in 11 days. I used the proceeds to fully fund a scholarship endowment at the community college where Dorothy had taken watercolor classes in the last few years of her life. The endowment supports adult learners returning to education after major life disruptions, job loss, illness, caregiving. It will carry Dorothy's name for as long as the college exists. I sat in the parking lot of that college for a long time after I signed the paperwork. It was a gray afternoon in late April, and the trees along the front of the building were just starting to come back. I thought about the $34,000. I thought about the legal pad with Vanessa's numbers on it. I thought about Miles standing at that window. Then I thought about Dorothy sitting at one of those tables inside, in a room with north-facing windows that she said gave the best light, learning something purely because she wanted to. That was the moment things started to feel different. Miles came to see me in May. He came alone, which I hadn't expected. He knocked on the door like a visitor, which he'd never done before in his life. I let him in, and we sat at the kitchen table, the same table where he and I had drunk coffee all those months. And he looked older than I'd seen him look before. He didn't make excuses for Vanessa. That surprised me too. He said he had been afraid of her for a long time. That wasn't how he said it exactly. He said he'd been going along with things he knew were wrong because it was easier than the alternative, and that he understood now what that had cost. He said he was talking to someone, a therapist. He'd started 2 months ago, about the time the notice went out. I listened. He asked if I was going to tell him what I had, what Dorothy and I had built. I told him the number. I watched his face when I said it. He didn't react the way I expected. He didn't look hungry or calculating. He looked, and I have thought about this many times since, he looked ashamed. He said, "You and Mom lived like that on purpose, didn't you?" I said yes. He said, "Because of people like Vanessa." I said, "Because of what money does to people who aren't ready for it, and because we wanted to know who you were before you knew what you'd inherit." He was quiet for a long time after that. I didn't hand him anything that day. No checks, no promises, no restoration of the will to its original terms. Those decisions would come slowly, if they came at all, and they would be based on things I observed over time, rather than conversations at a kitchen table. Dorothy had taught me that. She'd always said that words were the cheapest thing a person could offer. But I did tell Miles that the door wasn't closed. And I told him that Vanessa was not welcome in this house again. Not because I was angry. The anger had burned down to something quieter by then. But because some things, once they happen, change the shape of the space between people, and that shape doesn't go back. He nodded. He said he understood. He left around 7. I stood on the porch and watched his car until I couldn't see the taillights anymore. The street was quiet. The neighborhood smelled like cut grass and someone's grill a few houses down. That particular early summer smell that I have always loved, that Dorothy loved. I went inside and poured myself a small glass of the good bourbon I kept in the cabinet above the refrigerator, the bottle I'd been saving for no particular reason except that some things should be saved until you actually feel like celebrating. I think I finally felt like it. Not because I had won something. I'm not sure what winning even looks like in a situation like this. You don't win when your son has spent years watching his wife treat you like a problem to be managed. You don't win when you realize the person you raised made choices that broke your heart for years before you let yourself see it clearly. There's no trophy for any of that. But there is something that happens when you stop making yourself small for people who will never be satisfied no matter how much space you give them. Something that straightens in your spine. Something that feels, if not like winning, then at least like being honest with yourself, with the situation, with the memory of the woman who squeezed your hand under a Thanksgiving table and said, quietly, "She's counting things, Ray." Dorothy was right about that, like she was right about most things. The scholarship letters went out in the fall. 12 recipients that first year. Adults from all over the county, people going back to school after hard years. The foundation sent me the list. I didn't know any of them. I wasn't supposed to know them. That was the point. But I kept the list in the drawer next to Dorothy's picture. And some mornings, before I go out to meet Bernard and the others at the park, I open the drawer and look at it. That's what $9 million can do when it's handled by people who understand what it's actually for. I've been sitting with this story long enough now that I can tell it without my jaw tightening the way it used to. What I keep coming back to isn't the slap, though that's the part people will probably remember. It's the window. Miles standing at that window with his hands in his pockets, looking at the floor, while his wife hit his father hard enough to knock my glasses sideways. That image stayed with me longer than the sting did, because the slap was Vanessa's choice. The window was my son's. There's something I've learned about cause and effect that took me most of my life to really understand. Not just intellectually, but in the way you understand things that have actually cost you something. Every pattern in a relationship gets there through a series of small allowances. Nobody wakes up one morning and decides to treat someone badly out of nowhere. It builds. You allow something small, and then something slightly larger, and eventually you've allowed so much that the shape of the relationship has changed completely without either person quite noticing when it happened. I allowed a lot with Miles and Vanessa. I told myself it was grace, it was patience, it was what family does. Some of it was, but some of it was just avoidance dressed up in better clothes. Dorothy knew. She always knew. She'd built her whole life on a kind of quiet moral clarity that I spent 41 years admiring and only partially managed to absorb. She didn't moralize. She didn't lecture. She just saw things clearly and then acted accordingly. That's the hardest version of doing right by people, not the kind that announces itself, but the kind that just keeps showing up in the choices you make when nobody's watching. The scholarship isn't named after Dorothy because I wanted credit for something. It's named after her because she earned it, and the way you earn things slowly, over decades, by being the kind of person who is the same when they're alone as when they're in a room full of people. What Miles is learning now, slowly I think, in whatever room he's sitting in with his therapist on Thursday afternoons, is that real strength isn't about controlling what's around you. It's about having enough of a spine to stand in a kitchen while your wife is doing something wrong and say stop. That's it. That's the whole thing. One word. He couldn't find it then. I hope he's looking for it now. And what I had to learn, which is harder to admit, is that protecting your dignity isn't the same as being cold. I spent too long confusing the two. I thought that holding firm meant hardening entirely. That if I drew a line, it had to mean I stopped caring what was on the other side. But the door I left open for Miles, I left it open because I meant it. Because the man at that window isn't the boy I raised, and I'm not willing to believe yet that they're the same person permanently. $9 million. People will fixate on the number. I understand that. But the number is the least interesting part of the story to me. The interesting part is what Dorothy and I decided to do with it. Not in the end, but from the beginning. We decided that money was a tool for building something real, not a scoreboard, not a weapon, and not a reason for anyone to love us. We lived like ordinary people, because we were ordinary people who happened to have made careful choices over a long period of time, and we kept it quiet because we'd watched what visibility does to relationships that can't handle it. The list of scholarship recipients is still in the drawer next to Dorothy's picture. 12 names, first year. People I'll never meet, getting a chance they might not have had otherwise. That's what I want this to have meant. Not the slap, not the house sale, not any of it, just that.